The morning sun had barely touched the dry hills when Ethan Cole saddled his horse. The sky was pale orange and the air was still cold from the night. He was a man of quiet habits, living alone on a small ranch at the edge of the desert. Every day began the same. He checked his fences, counted his cattle, and rode along the borders of his land. The silence was his only company now. Years ago, he had a wife and a little daughter, but sickness took them both, leaving him with nothing but his work and his horse, Jasper. That morning felt different, though. The wind carried a strange chill, and even the birds were quiet. Ethan rode along the narrow trail by the river bend, where tall cottonwoods swayed above the flowing water. The land was rough, but he knew every inch of it. He had mended every fence post, cleared every fallen branch, and buried more than one animal that didn't survive the cold nights. Life here was hard, but it was all he knew. As he rode past the old oak tree near the river, something caught his eye. A dark shape hanging low, barely moving in the wind. At first he thought it might be a dead deer caught in the branches, but then his heart skipped a beat. The shape was too small, too still, and the hair blowing across it looked human. He urged Jasper closer, his stomach tightening. When he came close enough, he froze. Hanging by the wrists from a low branch was a young Apache girl, her head slumped forward, her feet barely touching the ground. Her skin was pale from the cold and her clothes were torn. Around her neck hung a wooden sign with rough letters burned into it. "White man don't forgive." For a long moment, Ethan couldn't move. The words hit him harder than the sight. The world had become cruel, both for the settlers and the native tribes. He had seen men kill each other out of fear, and children left crying in the dust. But this was different. Whoever had done this wanted her to suffer. He jumped off his horse and rushed toward her. When he touched her wrist, he felt a weak pulse. "You're alive," he whispered. Carefully, he cut the rope with his knife, lowering her into his arms. She was light as a bird, her breath shallow. Her face was streaked with dirt and blood, and there was a bruise on her temple. He looked around, half expecting to see someone watching from the bushes, but the land was empty and quiet. Only the river whispered nearby. He didn't know what to do. If he brought her into town, the sheriff might accuse him of kidnapping, and the townspeople would never forgive him for helping an Apache. But he couldn't leave her there to die. He lifted her onto Jasper and climbed up behind, holding her carefully against his chest. The ride home felt longer than ever. The wind picked up dust and the horse stumbled once or twice, but Ethan didn't stop. The girl's head rested weakly against his arm, her long black hair brushing his coat. When he reached the ranch, he carried her inside his cabin. The fire had gone cold, so he lit it again, filling the small room with warm light. He laid her on his bed and covered her with a wool blanket. For hours he watched her breathe, unsure if she would survive the night. He cleaned the wounds on her wrists and gave her water, which she sipped with trembling lips before falling asleep again. Ethan sat by the window, staring at the sign he had brought back with him. "White man don't forgive." He turned it over in his hands, feeling the rough wood. The words burned deeper than any brand. They reminded him of the times he had seen hatred on both sides. He had once helped a wounded Apache boy years ago, hiding him in his barn until he healed. The townsfolk never forgave him for that either. People carried anger like a badge of pride. The night stretched long. Coyotes howled somewhere in the distance, and the sound of rain tapped lightly on the roof. Ethan dozed off in the chair beside her bed, waking every few minutes to check if she was still breathing. At one point, she stirred and murmured something in her language, soft, broken words he couldn't understand. Her hand moved weakly, as if she was trying to reach someone who wasn't there. In the morning, the sun poured through the window, warming the wooden floor. Ethan made coffee and cooked a bit of bread, then sat quietly beside her. Her eyes fluttered open for the first time. They were dark, deep, and full of fear. She tried to sit up but fell back. "Easy," Ethan said softly. "You're safe here." She looked around, confused, then at him. Her lips moved as if she wanted to speak, but no words came. He guessed she didn't understand English. He brought her a cup of water, and after a moment she took it with trembling fingers. "Name?" he asked gently, pointing at her chest. "You?" She frowned, not understanding, then whispered a single word, almost too faint to hear. "Naya," Ethan repeated it slowly. "Naya." She nodded weakly. He smiled a little for the first time in a long while. "I'm Ethan," he said, tapping his chest. "Ethan?" She blinked, watching him closely, then whispered, "Etan." It wasn't perfect, but he chuckled softly. For the next few hours, she slept again while Ethan repaired the barn doors and fetched water from the well. His mind, however, was restless. He wondered who had left her there and why. The sign suggested anger, maybe from settlers, maybe from her own people. The thought made him uneasy. The land around them was full of grudges that never died. By evening, Naya woke again. Ethan brought her some soup, and though she hesitated at first, hunger won. She ate slowly, her eyes never leaving him. Each time he moved closer, she flinched as if expecting harm. That hurt him more than he expected. He knew fear well, but seeing it in her eyes reminded him of how cruel people could be. After she finished eating, she pointed to the door, saying something he couldn't understand. Her voice was pleading.
He guessed she wanted to leave.
"No," he said gently, shaking his head. "Not yet. You're hurt." She frowned, then wrapped the blanket tighter around herself and turned away. Ethan sighed. He knew trust couldn't be forced. It would take time. That night he sat outside the cabin looking at the stars. The sky was full of them, shining cold and endless. He remembered his wife, how she used to sit beside him on nights like this, humming softly. He hadn't spoken to anyone in weeks, and now this girl had entered his life like a ghost from another world. He didn't know what fate wanted from him, but deep inside he felt that saving her had a purpose. When he went back inside, Naya was sleeping peacefully, her breathing steady. The wooden sign still lay on the table, but Ethan had turned it face down. He didn't want to see those words again. He knew what they meant, anger, revenge, pain, but he also knew something else. Sometimes forgiveness began quietly, in small acts that no one saw. He looked at her one last time before blowing out the lamp. "You'll be all right," he whispered. "I'll make sure of it." The wind outside softened and the night grew calm. In the flicker of the dying fire, Ethan sat back in his chair, unaware that this small act of mercy would soon change both of their lives forever. The next few days passed quietly on Ethan's ranch. The young Apache girl Naya stayed mostly silent, watching everything around her with cautious eyes. She didn't understand much of what Ethan said, and he didn't know her language either, but somehow, they started to find small ways to understand each other. Every morning, Ethan made breakfast, coffee for himself and warm milk with bread for her. She always waited until he took a bite first, as if to be sure it was safe. Her body was still weak and her wrists carried red marks from the ropes. He treated them gently, wrapping clean cloth around them. Sometimes she would pull away, not out of anger, but fear. Her eyes told him she wasn't used to kindness. Ethan tried not to ask questions too soon. He could tell her past was heavy, full of pain. Instead, he showed her small things: how to pour water from the kettle, how to feed the horse, how to gather firewood without cutting her hands. At first, she watched him like a wild bird trapped in a cage. But little by little, she began to mimic his actions. One afternoon, while he was mending a fence, he saw her walking carefully around the yard, touching everything with curiosity. She stopped near his old dog, Rusty, who was lying by the porch. Rusty growled softly and Naya froze. Ethan called out, "Easy, Rusty," and to his surprise, Naya repeated softly, "Easy." Rusty wagged his tail and Ethan couldn't help but smile. That night, he wrote a few words on a small slate board he kept for noting supplies. "Water," he wrote, pointing at the jug. Then "fire," pointing at the stove. Naya looked puzzled but interested. Slowly, she tried saying the words. "Water," she said carefully. Her accent was soft, the syllables broken but sweet. Ethan nodded and clapped his hands once. "Good," he said with a smile. For the first time, she smiled back. Just a small, shy curve of her lips, but it warmed the cabin more than the fire. Days turned into weeks. Naya grew stronger and began to help with simple chores. She swept the floor, washed dishes, and even learned to milk the cow with Ethan's guidance. She laughed quietly the first time milk splashed onto her dress, and Ethan laughed too. It had been years since he heard laughter in that house. One morning, as he chopped wood near the barn, he noticed her watching from a distance. She pointed to the axe and then to herself. "No," he said firmly, shaking his head. "Too heavy." But she walked over anyway and picked it up with both hands. The axe nearly dropped from her grip, but she straightened her arms and swung once, splitting the log cleanly in half. Ethan blinked in surprise. She looked at him, proud of herself, her eyes shining. He chuckled and said, "All right, maybe I was wrong about that." It was a simple moment, but it made something inside him soften. She wasn't a fragile child. She had spirit and strength hidden beneath her quietness. However, peace never lasted long in those parts. One afternoon, when Ethan rode into town to buy supplies, he noticed a few men whispering near the general store. Sheriff Wilson, a heavy man with gray mustache, nodded at him but didn't smile. "Cole," he said. "Heard you've got company out there on your ranch. Someone saw a shadow in your window." Ethan kept his voice calm. "I don't know what you're talking about." The sheriff leaned on the counter. "You know how folks are these days. After what happened with the Apaches last spring, people are nervous. If they think you're hiding one, it could turn ugly." Ethan paid for his supplies without another word and left the store. His jaw tightened. He knew how fast rumors could spread. Once people's fear took hold, it didn't matter what the truth was. When he returned home, Naya was sitting by the window waiting. She ran out when she saw him, relief clear on her face. That small gesture reminded him that even though they came from different worlds, they shared something, the pain of being alone and judged. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Ethan took the old sign that once hung around her neck. He had kept it hidden, but now he placed it on the table. "You know this?" he asked softly, tapping the burned letters. Naya looked at it, her face pale. She whispered something in her language, then pointed to herself, then to the air as if remembering something painful. Tears welled up in her eyes. She spoke broken English, trying hard to form words. "My people. Angry, I help. White soldier, they say. Traitor." Ethan felt a lump in his throat. "They did this to you?" She didn't answer, but her silence said enough. He sat there quietly for a long time, the crackling fire filling the silence. Finally, he said, "You did the right thing. Helping someone doesn't make you bad." She looked at him, confused but touched by his tone. He pointed at the sign again and said, "No more hate." Then he took his knife and carved a single line across the hateful words, scratching them out completely. She watched him with wide eyes, then whispered, "No, hate." For the first time, she said something in English without hesitation. The days grew warmer. The grass on the hills turned green, and the sky stayed bright longer each evening. Ethan noticed how Naya began to hum softly while she worked, gentle tunes that carried across the yard like wind through tall grass. Sometimes he stopped his chores just to listen. It reminded him of his daughter, who used to hum the same way while feeding chickens. But the peace between them was fragile. When he rode into town again a week later, 2 men followed him out to his wagon. One spat on the ground. "You think you can bring one of them to our land and nobody'll care?" Ethan turned slowly, keeping his voice calm. "You're talking nonsense," the man sneered. "We seen her, Cole, Apache girl in your yard. You better send her back where she belongs before someone else does it for you." Ethan's hands curled into fists, but he said nothing. He drove home, his heart heavy. The hatred in those men's eyes reminded him of war. He knew how easily it could turn violent. That night, Naya sensed something was wrong. Ethan sat by the window, quiet and thoughtful. She came over and placed her hand on his arm, her small fingers trembling. "Bad?" she asked. He nodded. "Some people don't understand." She looked down, her expression full of sadness. "I go," she whispered. "I go back." Ethan turned to her sharply. "No, you're safe here." She shook her head. "You hurt if I stay." He sighed deeply. "You don't worry about me. I've faced worse than words." Then he smiled faintly and added, "Besides, I could use the help around here." She didn't understand every word, but his calm tone eased her. She sat down again, and for a while they simply listened to the crackling fire. As days passed, their silent friendship grew stronger. Ethan taught her more English words: sky, horse, bread, thank you. Each evening she repeated them softly, proud of each one she learned. Sometimes she tried to teach him her words too, laughing when he mispronounced them. Ethan found himself speaking more, even telling her stories about his past. He told her about his wife, who loved wildflowers, and his daughter, who used to braid his horse's mane. Naya listened with soft eyes, as if she understood more with her heart than her ears. One morning he woke to find her standing outside, feeding Jasper with handfuls of hay. The sunrise painted her face golden, and for a moment Ethan saw not an outcast girl but a young woman full of quiet strength. He knew then that something had changed inside him. Saving her had not only saved her life, it had brought light back into his own. but deep down he also knew their peace couldn't last forever. The world outside his ranch still burned with old hatred, and soon it would come knocking on his door. Yet that morning, as he watched her smile at his horse and whisper gentle words, Ethan decided he wouldn't let fear rule his heart again. For now, this small corner of the world was safe, and maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something better. The following weeks brought both peace and quiet worry to Ethan's ranch. The land had turned green again after the spring rains, and the air smelled of fresh soil and wildflowers. Every morning, Naya helped Ethan with chores, feeding the animals, washing clothes, collecting eggs, and tending the small vegetable patch near the porch. She had learned many English words now, enough to speak in short sentences. Sometimes she surprised him with how fast she learned. "Horse hungry," she would say, pointing toward Jasper's stall. Ethan would nod, smiling. "Then you better feed him." She would laugh, proud of herself, and hurry off with a bucket of hay. But even though their days seemed peaceful, Ethan could feel unease in the air. When he rode to town again, he could see the stares following him. Men at the saloon lowered their voices when he passed, and women outside the store turned away. Rumors had spread faster than wildfire. People said he was harboring a savage, that he had lost his mind letting one live under his roof. The sheriff called him aside near the general store. "Ethan," he said with a tired sigh, "you know how this town is? Folks don't forget what the Apaches did last year. They lost people, same as your losses. They don't want reminders walking around." Ethan kept his tone calm. "She's a child, not a reminder." The sheriff frowned. "Doesn't matter. People see what they want to see. I can't protect you if they decide to take matters into their own hands." Ethan said nothing more. He rode home with heavy thoughts. He didn't want trouble, but he couldn't send Naya away. She had nowhere to go. The land was still dangerous for someone alone, especially a young girl caught between two worlds. That evening, Naya noticed his silence. "Bad?" she asked softly as she set a plate on the table. Ethan nodded slowly. "People in town. They talk too much." She tilted her head, trying to understand. "They hate me?" he sighed. "They don't know you." She thought about that for a long moment, then said quietly, "You know me." Ethan looked at her, surprised by the gentle truth in her voice. He smiled faintly. "Yes, I do." Over time, she began to open up more about her past. Her English was still broken, but he understood enough. She told him that her father had been a brave warrior, killed in a raid years ago. Her mother died from fever not long after. Naya had been raised by her uncle, a strict man who believed helping white settlers was betrayal. When soldiers once entered their camp, one young soldier was wounded and left behind. Naya, barely 15 then, had helped him survive by giving him water and hiding him until he could walk again. Her tribe found out and called her a traitor. They tied her to the tree as punishment and left her to die. The settlers who found her didn't help either. They left the cruel sign as a warning. Ethan listened quietly, his heart aching with every word. "You saved a man's life and they punished you," he said softly. "That's not justice." She looked down. "World not fair," she whispered. He nodded slowly. "You're right, but maybe we can make our small part of it better." After that day, they worked together more closely than ever. Ethan taught her how to ride Jasper. At first she was afraid, gripping the saddle too tight, but soon she learned to balance, her long black hair flying in the wind as the horse trotted across the open field. She laughed freely, a sound Ethan had not heard from her before. It made him forget his worries for a while. Sometimes at night they sat outside watching the stars. Naya pointed at constellations she knew from her tribe's stories, naming them softly. Ethan listened, fascinated by how her people saw the same stars but told different tales about them. He shared stories his father told him when he was young, and though their words came from different worlds, their hearts seemed to understand the same truths. But peace can never stay long when hate lingers nearby. One afternoon, Ethan noticed a trail of hoof prints leading up to the ranch gate. Someone had been watching the property. He found a torn piece of cloth snagged on the fence, part of a settler's shirt. His gut tightened. That night, as they ate supper, Naya looked up suddenly and whispered, "Eyes." Ethan turned toward the window but saw nothing in the darkness. He went outside with his rifle and stood silently by the porch. The wind rustled the grass, and somewhere in the distance a horse snorted. Whoever had been watching was gone now, but the feeling remained. The next day, Ethan went to town to buy feed and nails. When he arrived, the general store owner, Mr. Hayes, gave him a cold look. Word is you've got yourself an Apache pet, he said bitterly. Don't expect folks to buy your cattle no more if that's true. Ethan kept his voice steady. You can believe what you want. I take care of my own. Mr. Hayes spat on the ground. Then take care to keep her away from our town. Ethan left without saying another word. On his way home, his hands trembled slightly on the reins. He wasn't afraid for himself. He had lived through worse, but he feared what angry men might do to Naya. When he reached home, Naya came running from the barn. You hurt? She asked, seeing his tight face. No, he said quietly. Just tired of people. That evening, the wind turned strong, pushing dark clouds across the sky. Ethan stood by the fire, thinking deeply. Naya sat near the table, carving something small from a piece of wood. When she finished, she handed it to him shyly. It was a tiny wooden horse. For you, she said. He looked at it for a moment, touched. You made this? She nodded proudly. You help me. I make for you. Ethan smiled softly. Thank you, Naya, it's beautiful. He placed it on the mantel beside an old photograph of his wife and daughter. For a moment, the cabin felt warm again, like home used to feel long ago, but their peace would soon be tested. The next morning, Ethan found a crude message scratched into his barn door with a knife. Leave her or pay the price. He stared at the words for a long time, his jaw tight. He didn't tell Naya right away. He didn't want to frighten her. Instead, he fixed the door and went on with the day as usual. But that night, when she saw him sitting awake long after dark, staring into the fire, she knew something was wrong. You afraid? She asked softly. Ethan looked at her and shook his head. No, but I'm angry that people can't see the good in others. She moved closer, her expression full of concern. I'm sorry, she whispered. He looked at her, surprised. You have nothing to be sorry for, Naya. She shook her head. I bring trouble. Ethan's voice softened. No, you brought life back to this place. You've done nothing wrong. She said nothing more but sat near him in silence. Outside, the wind howled and the lantern light flickered on the walls. Ethan couldn't help but wonder if he was ready for what was coming. Still, the next morning he went about his chores as usual, refusing to live in fear. Naya followed his lead. She worked beside him, carrying water, feeding the animals, and humming her quiet songs. One afternoon, she found him fixing a broken fence post and handed him a nail without him asking. He smiled. You're getting good at this. She grinned, proud of herself. I learned from good teacher. Those words filled him with quiet pride. It wasn't about teaching her work. It was about teaching her to trust again, to believe that kindness still existed. That night after supper, they sat by the fire once more. Ethan finally decided to tell her about the message carved on the barn. She didn't seem surprised. People fear what they don't know, she said simply, her English clearer than ever. Ethan looked at her with admiration. She was wiser than her years, and stronger than most grown men he knew. You're right, he said, but sometimes it takes courage to change people's hearts. She nodded slowly. You have courage, Ethan. He smiled faintly. Maybe, but so do you. As the firelight danced on their faces, both of them knew their bond had become more than chance. It was a quiet friendship born from pain and kindness, from two broken lives finding strength in each other. And though danger still lurked in the shadows beyond the ranch fence, Ethan knew one thing for sure. He would not abandon her. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The next few days brought a strange calm to the ranch, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. Ethan could feel it in the air. Even the animals seemed restless. Rusty barked at nothing, and Jasper often raised his head, ears twitching toward the woods. Ethan tried to stay busy with work, fixing fences and checking the cattle, but his mind was never at peace. He kept glancing at the hills, half expecting to see riders coming down toward his home. Naya noticed his unease. She watched him from the porch, her small hands holding a basket of corn she had husked. You think bad men come? She asked one morning as the sky turned gray. Ethan didn't answer right away. He was tightening the saddle on Jasper and looking toward the west where dark clouds gathered in the distance. I don't know, he said finally. But if they do, we'll be ready. He didn't mean weapons or fighting. He just meant he would protect her no matter what happened. That afternoon, the wind grew wild. Thick clouds rolled over the sky and thunder rumbled far away. Ethan went around locking the barn doors and covering the feed sacks. Naya helped without needing to be told. She carried buckets of water inside, tied the chicken's pen shut, and made sure the firewood was stacked under the porch roof. By evening, the storm hit. Rain poured like a waterfall, pounding the roof and shaking the windows. Lightning flashed across the sky, followed by long rolls of thunder that made the ground tremble. Ethan checked the fire in the hearth and then looked out the window toward the barn. Through the sheets of rain, he thought he saw movement, something bright like firelight. His heart stopped. "Naya," he shouted, grabbing his coat. "Stay inside." But she was already beside him, eyes wide with fear. Together they ran into the storm, the wind slapping their faces. When they reached the barn, Ethan froze. The side wall was glowing orange. Flames licked the wooden boards, spreading fast. Someone had thrown a torch through the open gap near the back door. "Get the horses," Ethan yelled. He ran to the stalls while Naya rushed to open the gate. The fire crackled louder and smoke filled the air, stinging their eyes. Jasper neighed in panic, kicking his stall door. Ethan cut the rope and pulled him out. Naya coughed hard but didn't stop working. She opened every stall until all the animals ran out into the rain. The fire grew stronger despite the storm. Ethan grabbed a shovel and tried to beat down the smaller flames, but the wind only fanned them higher. Suddenly, a beam above them cracked and fell. Ethan pushed Naya out of the way just in time. They both fell into the mud as the barn roof collapsed in a roar of fire and smoke. When the flames finally began to die under the heavy rain, Ethan's arms and face were burned in places, and his clothes were torn. Naya's hands were black with soot, and she coughed as she tried to help him stand. Together they watched the barn crumble. All of Ethan's tools, feed, and half his winter supplies were gone. They stumbled back into the cabin, soaked and shaking. Ethan sat down hard by the fire, trying to catch his breath. Naya knelt beside him, gently cleaning the burn on his arm with wet cloth. "You hurt?" she said softly. He smiled weakly. "I've had worse." As she wrapped his arm, he noticed her eyes full of worry. "You did good out there," he said. "You saved the animals." She looked down, whispering, "They hate you now." "Because of me." Ethan took a deep breath. "They don't need a reason to hate, Naya. Some people just carry it like a disease." She didn't understand all his words, but she knew his meaning. She finished bandaging his arm and sat beside him in silence. The rain outside began to slow, tapping gently against the windows. When morning came, the sky was pale and quiet again. Smoke still rose from the barn's blackened remains. Ethan walked out slowly, looking over the damage. Naya followed him, her eyes full of guilt. He picked up a piece of charred wood and turned it over. On one of the unburned boards near the gate, a knife mark showed words carved deep into the wood. "You chose the wrong side." Naya gasped softly. "They come for you," she whispered. Ethan looked at her and shook his head. "No, they came for you. But they'll have to go through me first." Tears welled in her eyes. "I go," she said, her voice trembling. "No more trouble." He turned sharply. "You're not leaving." "But no." His tone was firm but gentle. "You think walking away will stop hate? It won't. The only way to end it is to stand against it." Naya lowered her head, tears falling silently down her cheeks. Ethan reached out and rested his hand lightly on her shoulder. "You've done nothing wrong," he said softly. "Don't let them make you believe otherwise." For the next few days they worked side by side to rebuild what they could. Ethan made a small shelter for the animals with spare lumber, while Naya cleaned tools and gathered what supplies survived. She worked tirelessly, refusing to rest even when her hands bled. When Ethan told her to stop, she only shook her head and said, "We strong." At night they sat together near the fire. Ethan told her stories of his childhood, of his father teaching him how to fish, of how he met his wife in a small church dance long ago. Naya listened quietly, her eyes reflecting the firelight. Then one evening, she told him a story of her own, a story from her tribe about a bird that carried rain in its wings. It was said that when the bird sang after a fire, it brought new life to the land. Ethan smiled at her words. "Then maybe that bird will visit us soon," he said. Naya nodded. "Maybe already here." The days grew brighter, and slowly the pain of loss began to fade. But the sign carved on the barn wall stayed in Ethan's mind like a scar. He knew whoever had done this wasn't finished yet. One afternoon, while repairing the fence, Ethan saw movement far off by the ridge, a small group of riders. His heart tightened. He fetched his rifle and watched quietly from the porch. The riders didn't come closer, but he could tell from their distance that they were watching. After a few minutes, they turned their horses and rode away. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat by the window staring into the darkness. Naya woke and came to sit beside him. "You not sleep?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "Just thinking." "About them?" she asked. "About everything," he said. Then he looked at her and smiled faintly. "You should sleep. You've done enough for one day." She hesitated, then said, "You help me. I help you. We same now." He looked at her with surprise, then nodded slowly. "Yes, we are." The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds, bright and warm. The smell of burned wood still lingered in the air, but the land looked peaceful again. Naya was feeding the chickens when Ethan walked over with a piece of the old wooden sign in his hand. The part that once said, "White man don't forgive." He had taken his knife and carved new words into it. When he showed her, she covered her mouth in surprise. It now read simply, "Forgive." She looked at him with tears in her eyes. "You change words," she whispered. He nodded. "We can't change the past, but we can change what we leave behind." She smiled through her tears. "You good man, Ethan." He shook his head softly. "Just a man trying to do what's right." That night, as the sun set behind the hills, the sky glowed orange and gold. Naya sat on the porch singing her tribe's soft rain song. Ethan listened from his chair, his heart calm for the first time in months. The sound of her voice mixed with the rustle of the wind and the call of distant coyotes. Though they didn't know what the future would bring. One thing had changed. The fear that once filled their hearts had turned into quiet strength. The world outside might still carry hate, but inside that little ranch, forgiveness had already begun to grow. A few peaceful weeks passed after the fire. The land slowly healed, and so did the two souls living on it. The burned barn was now only a black skeleton, but Ethan had built a small new one beside it. It wasn't as large or fine, yet it was enough for the horses and cows to stay safe. Naya helped him every day, carrying wood, holding nails, and even climbing ladders, though he kept telling her not to. She was stronger than she looked. Every morning she would bring breakfast to the porch, cornbread, milk, and sometimes a few berries she had found by the stream. Ethan grew used to hearing her soft humming while the sun rose. The ranch didn't feel lonely anymore. There was laughter again, though quiet and gentle, like the wind brushing through the grass. One warm afternoon, Ethan rode into town to sell a few cattle. He hoped maybe time had cooled the townspeople's anger. But when he reached the general store, the men there grew silent again. Sheriff Wilson came out, his expression serious. "Ethan," he said slowly, "you best be careful. Word is the Apache tribe's been seen not far from here. They might be looking for someone." Ethan's stomach tightened. "You mean Naya?" The sheriff gave a small nod. "Could be. Some of the men say she's wanted for breaking tribal law. Others say her people want to take her back. Whatever the truth is, it's best you keep your doors locked." Ethan paid for his supplies and left quietly. As he rode home, the sun was setting behind the hills and a long shadow stretched across the valley. He couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was coming again. When he reached the ranch, Naya was feeding Jasper. She smiled when she saw him, but her face changed when she noticed his worry. "Something bad?" she asked. Ethan took off his hat and sighed. "Your people might be coming." She froze, her eyes wide. "They find me?" "Maybe," he said softly. "But we'll see what they want." That night the wind blew cold again and neither of them slept much. Ethan kept his rifle near the door, though he prayed he wouldn't need it. Naya sat by the fire, whispering words in her own language, a prayer perhaps. At dawn, the sound of distant hooves broke the silence. Ethan stepped outside, his heart beating fast. Across the field, 5 riders were approaching, moving in a straight line. Their horses were painted with tribal marks. He recognized them as Apache. Naya followed him to the porch, clutching his arm. "It is them," she whispered. "My uncle come." When the riders stopped a few yards from the porch, their leader, a tall man with silver hair and deep, stern eyes, looked directly at Ethan. "We come for the girl," he said in rough English. "She belongs with her people." Ethan kept his voice calm but firm. "She's free now. She belongs to no one." The man frowned. "She broke our law. She helped white soldier. She must return." Before Ethan could reply, Naya stepped forward. Her small frame stood straight and proud. She looked at her uncle and said something in Apache, her voice steady but emotional. Ethan couldn't understand the words, but he could see the story in her eyes. Everything she had endured, everything she had learned. She spoke for several minutes. Her uncle's face softened, then hardened again. He shouted something back, but she didn't back down. Finally, she turned toward Ethan and spoke in English so all could hear. He say I betray tribe. I say I save man because heart tell me it right. I not bad. I want peace. Her uncle looked at Ethan again. White man teach you these words? Ethan shook his head. No, she learned them herself. The old man studied him for a long moment. You help her? I saved her, Ethan said simply. But she saved me too. The man's eyes narrowed slightly, then softened just enough to show thought. He looked at Naya again, speaking softly in his language. She answered quietly, tears in her eyes. Then the old man turned to his riders and gave a short nod. Without another word, they turned their horses around. Before leaving, the man looked back and said something that made Naya gasp softly. When they were gone, Ethan asked, What did he say? She wiped her eyes and smiled faintly. He say maybe one white man can forgive. Ethan's chest tightened with emotion. He looked out toward the horizon where the riders disappeared and whispered, Maybe one can. The days after that visit were strangely peaceful. It felt as if the world had finally taken a breath. The townsfolk stopped whispering about Ethan, perhaps because they realized the Apache weren't coming for revenge. Naya began to walk into town with him sometimes, though people still stared. The children were the first to warm up to her. They liked her braids and the little wooden animals she carved. One day, a boy named Sam ran up to her and asked, Did you really live with the Indians? Naya smiled shyly and said, I still do. I am Apache, the boy grinned. That's cool. Ethan watched from his wagon, smiling. It was a small moment, but it meant something big. The walls of fear were slowly breaking. As weeks passed, Ethan noticed Naya growing more confident. She spoke more English now, laughed more freely, and even sang while she worked. One evening, she cooked a stew from her tribe's recipe, and the smell filled the cabin. When Ethan tasted it, he laughed. Best meal I've had in years, he said. She smiled proudly. I learned from Mother. She cooked same way. After supper, they sat outside watching the sky turn pink. The air was calm and crickets chirped from the fields. Ethan, she said quietly, when you find me, I think life finished now. I think maybe life start again. Ethan turned to her, his voice low. You gave me that gift too, Naya. I'd forgotten what peace felt like. She looked thoughtful. We both lost family, she said softly. But maybe now, we make new one. Ethan nodded slowly, touched by her words. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that whatever came, he would face it with her by his side. Months passed, and the ranch flourished again. The grass grew thick, the animals were strong, and laughter filled the house each evening. One afternoon, Ethan hung the old wooden sign on the barn door, the one that once carried cruel words. But now, carved across the front in neat letters, it read, Forgive, always. When Naya saw it, she touched the wood gently, her eyes bright with emotion. Good words, she said softly. Ethan smiled. They're yours as much as mine. In time, people in town began to accept Naya. She helped the local doctor care for the sick and taught children how to make crafts from wood and clay. The same men who once cursed Ethan now greeted him politely. Change didn't come fast, but it came quietly, like spring melting the last of winter snow. One evening, after a long day's work, Ethan and Naya sat on the porch watching the sunset. The sky burned gold, fading into deep purple. Rusty lay at their feet and Jasper grazed nearby. Ethan leaned back in his chair and said, Funny thing, Naya, a few months ago I thought my life was over. I had no one, nothing to look forward to. Then I found you hanging from that tree, and somehow, I found myself too. Naya looked at him with warmth in her eyes. Sometimes God sends pain so we can find heart again. He nodded quietly, thinking how right she was. The wind blew softly, carrying the scent of wildflowers from the hills. For a long while, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them was peaceful, filled with understanding. As the stars began to appear one by one, Naya whispered, Ethan, you think people ever stop hating? He looked up at the sky. Maybe not all at once. But if one man forgives and one heart learns to love again, maybe that's enough. She smiled and rested her head lightly against his shoulder. Then we start first? He nodded slowly, his gaze lost in the glowing horizon. Yes, he said softly. We start first. And as the night settled gently over the quiet ranch, the sign on the barn caught the last rays of the setting sun. its words glowing faintly like a promise. Forgive, always. It stood there not as a reminder of pain, but as proof that even in a world of hate, two hearts, one weary rancher and one brave Apache girl, had chosen something stronger than anger. They had chosen forgiveness, and that choice changed not just their lives, but the land around them too. From that day on, the ranch by the river bend was known as the Forgiveness Ranch, a place where no one was turned away and where the past no longer ruled. And as long as Ethan and Naya lived, its gates stayed open to all who needed kindness.